This screencast is about how to read research articles. And the slides were developed by my friend Candace Belanoff. And so I want to acknowledge her and also her dog Bee, because Bee is adorable. I love her almost as much as I love my dog Sam. She's a very adorable, squishy little pit bull face. So thank you to Candace and thank you to Bee. So the first thing I want to talk about is the format that research articles follow. And almost every research article will follow this format, probably with a little bit of variation based on both the journal that the article is published in and the topic or the field. So the first part of a research article will be the abstract, which is a summary usually of about 200 words. It gives you an overview of what the article looked at, what it found, and what the implications of these findings are. The authors will have selected usually about 4 to 6 keywords, and the keywords are used to index the article so that, which helps you find the article when you're looking in databases. So it has to do, it's a library science principle almost. And the keywords tend to be very generalized and just related to the subject of the article. So for example, the last article I published was related to disparities in age at diagnosis of developmental disabilities between kids of color and white kids. And so my keywords were developmental disability, diagnosis, disparity, health equity, and a keyword related to the method of the study. It used a very particular methodology. So after the abstract and the keywords comes the introduction and the context. And that introduction generally includes a literature review telling us what we already know about the topic and why this study that you're about to read isn't just recreating the wheel. And the introduction will also describe a little bit about what the research question was, what was being studied. Then there will be a section about methods, and the method section has some variation in terms of how it's organized, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then there'll be a section describing the findings. Sometimes this is also called the results. So what did we learn as a process of following these methods? And then there will be, the last section will be a discussion, which will include the limitations of the study. So what biases were at play. And we'll talk again more about the limitations in a minute. The discussion section will also talk about what are the implications of the findings or results. What should we be doing differently on a policy or practice level in response to the findings? And generally, research articles end with suggestions for future research. Mine tend to end with a plea for, I'm trying to set myself up for funding for the next study I want to do. So I'll describe how this study, what we found in this study, and the future research direction, which I also happen to be writing a grant to fund. So another way to think about this is we use this acronym IMRAD. So after the abstract, you'll have the introduction, the methods, the results or the findings, and the discussion. A way to think about the anatomy of the research article, I really like this, is to think of kind of an hourglass figure. And so we start very big picture. The abstract provides an overview of the article. And then we get to the introduction, which is very, very big picture. So here's the general topic area that we're in. The introduction gets a little bit narrower when it talks about what we already do know about this topic and what we don't know yet and why. And then at the very smallest piece of the hourglass, we have the end of the introduction where we say, here's what we set out to do and why. You know, given that we lack knowledge about how many zombies there are exactly in the greater Boston area, we decided to do this survey looking at, we decided to do a survey of Boston residents to find out how many zombies live in Boston. So we're at the very smallest part of the hourglass by the end of the introduction. So in other words, our literature review and our introduction and background section are leading to the need for our study. So then we move to the method section, which is also at the very little picture focused, looking at the how we did this study. The results, when we get to the results section, the hourglass starts to get a little bit wider. So we're in this part of the hourglass over here, talking about the specific results of our study, what we learned. And then on to the discussion, we're back at the, we're looking very big picture again, because we're talking about how our findings from this study and what we learned applied to the larger picture. So it's almost like we've come full circle from big picture of the topic we're on, the field, what's generally known, what we don't yet know, and why our study was necessary, how we did our study, what we found, and how what we found fits in with the larger context we presented at the beginning of the introduction. So the abstract is generally what we read first in a scientific article, and that's recommended because it's telling you the story in a very brief format. It's letting you know what will happen. The thing to keep in mind is that the abstract contains what the author, what the researchers think is most important. And it tends not to be the place, because we're selling our studies, it's not the place where we say, and we had a whole lot of bias and this was very limited. So keep that in mind. Moving from the abstract, the next section is the introduction, also sometimes called the background. Sometimes the introduction will have a section in it called the objectives, which describe very specifically the study's research question and specific aims. And the introduction is designed to give you the context of the study and to set you up to believe that it was in fact important to do our study. In some ways, we're selling you on why our study should be done. The method section, as I said, it contains many different components, and it can be thought of as a recipe almost for the study. So after reading this recipe, theoretically you should be able to replicate the study if you had, time and equipment needed. So the ingredients of the study are the data you use. So if the study is looking at already collected data, for example, census data, or data that you have already in your practice, administrative data about your clients, such as client charts or other information like that. That's the data used. Sometimes it's also called the data source. The next ingredient is the study population. So who is included? And this should have information about the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And recruitment, how were people recruited, what kind of sampling was used, was it random sampling or non-random sampling? There should be information about the variables, so what variables were being analyzed, and how were the variables operationalized? And as you read this section about the variables, which is sometimes also called measures, make sure to use a lot of good critical thinking around whether or not the authors are telling you how they operationalized variables. If you're not getting information about how the variables were operationalized, this is something to really keep in mind and think about what the potential biases might be here. What are the researchers assuming in not clarifying how they operationalize their variable, or in not operationalizing their variable very well? And also keep an eye out for potential confounding factors that you can think of in reading about the variables. A word you might hear used is covariates, and covariates is another kind of variable that researchers use math to adjust for. So, for example, you might hear language around, we adjusted for the following covariates: income and geographic location. And so that means in the results, the researchers will do some math to account for differences in income level and geographic location. The method section will also contain some instructions. So once we got this data, how was it analyzed? There should be a statement that the study was approved by the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. And there may or may not be further information about research ethics. Again, if this isn't mentioned, that should raise some red flags. So moving on, we'll get to the results or findings section of the study. And the results should be presented without commentary. They should be focused on the facts. That being said, which facts the researchers or authors choose to share can be very telling about their biases. This expression, just the facts, ma'am, I think is an incredibly sexist one. I should probably remove the ma'am from the slides. It's sort of implying that women or people who identify as a gender other than male are not good at presenting rational information, or might be irrational and need to be told to focus on the facts. However, gendered assumptions aside, the results section or findings section should present. It shouldn't make any guesses as to why. It should just tell you what was found in the study. There's often several tables in this section. Table 1 tends to be the demographics, or who was included. And when you look at Table 1, or the demographic table, think about what the researchers are telling you, but what the researchers aren't telling you. And this is a great place to apply what we've been talking about, what we talked about when we discussed theory around critical race theory. So if the researchers are telling you the race of the study participants, how did they operationalize that variable? And what's that telling you about their biases? Likewise, if the researchers aren't telling you about the race of the participants or the ethnicity of the participants, does that mean they're taking a colorblind approach? And how is that problematic, or how could that be problematic? And the same thing goes for other demographic variables too: disability status, gender. Is gender being operationalized as a binary? And if so, what does that tell you about the perhaps faulty or inaccurate assumptions that the researchers are making? Do you agree with how the variables, the demographic variables, were operationalized? And what does that tell you about the biases or assumptions in the study? And in general, the other tables about the results of the study will have more information, and what the authors consider important will also be described in narrative text. It's always a good idea to compare the narrative text to the tables and see what the authors consider important, and think about whether you agree. Are there things in the table that you think are important enough to be presented in narrative in the results section? And are there things the authors included that you think are less important? And so then the discussion section, sometimes it's called commentary, and sometimes it's called conclusions. This section will expand on the meaning and the interpretation of the results or the findings. So there tends to be a brief recap of the findings, and then the authors talk about their interpretation. And keep in mind that their interpretation of the findings might not be your interpretation of the findings. Their interpretation of the findings might be pretty biased. They generally will talk about how this study compares to or fits with other studies in the field. So you'll hear things like, the findings from this study were consistent with findings by so-and-so and so-and-so, although we noticed a higher rate of whatever than a study by so-and-so did. So it will help fit this study into the literature as a whole. They might offer some explanations for what they found or posit theories. Keep in mind that it's rare for a single study to be able to definitively explain cause and effect. So the explanations that you hear may or may not be true of the entire population, or they may or may not explain all of the results. So think critically about that too. Almost every article will talk about limitations of the study. So what were some biases that might have been present? What were some things that didn't get to be analyzed, some questions that don't get to be answered? How could the study be better? How generalizable is the study? When I was taught to write journal articles, I was told to do that thing that people do in job interviews when they ask you what your biggest weakness is, and you say something like, well, my biggest weakness is that I work too hard, or my biggest weakness is that I'm always punctual, and people find that annoying. I've tried to get away from that in my work. I think it's important to be upfront about limitations. That's not the convention, though. And so kind of keep that in mind as you read the limitations section. Are the authors using the limitations section to sell their work ethic? Or are they using the limitations section to be upfront about their biases, and or is it a combination? There'll also be a discussion of the study's strengths, which you should evaluate how much you agree with these strengths. Is this actually a strong study, or is it like when my friend bought a car recently and was told, well, the transmission doesn't work super well, but that's great if you want to do drag racing. This car will go extra fast because there's some issues with the brakes, so the car will go extra fast. She did not buy that particular car. So think about whether the strengths really are as strong as the study authors are presenting them. The authors will usually suggest some clinical, practical, programmatic, or policy implications. And again, keep in mind this is the author's opinion. This is the author's chance to sell their program, perhaps. So think about whether you agree with the implications that the author outlined, or if you think there are other implications or different implications. And there's generally a discussion of future research that's needed, or future research that the author is hoping to get funded. And then there will sometimes be a conclusion, which is an overall wrap-up paragraph. And so the discussion is making sense of sort of locating the study that was done as a single piece of the larger puzzle being the issue that was presented in the introduction. So how does this one little puzzle piece fit in with the big picture? And what other pieces are left that still need to be investigated? And reading a journal article is not like reading Harry Potter. When you read Harry Potter, you start at the very beginning, you read through in order. It's considered bad form to skip to the end and find out whether or not he who shall not be named wins the great battle. You're not supposed to do that. I tend to do that when I read. However, that's what you should be doing when you read a journal article. So you're not always going to read in order. And to be honest, many busy professionals will just read the abstract. So begin reading a scientific article or a journal article by reading the title. What does it tell you? Look at who wrote it. Do you know this person? Do you, from what you know of them, do you agree with their values? Who do they work for? Who are they affiliated with? If the study you're reading is from, the Council to Promote People Spending a Lot of Money on the Curriculum We're Selling, that gives you a hint that there might be a little bit biased. Look at what the journal is and the year. How recent is this? And think about why you're reading this article. What does it relate to in your clinical or professional or personal life? So read the abstract and read it backwards. Start with the conclusions and then look at the results and the methods in the background. And that lets you know if you want to, like speed dating, if you want to continue reading this article. It might not be relevant to your topic area. After you've looked at the abstract, look at the ending. Read the first paragraph of the discussion section, where most authors will sum up the results and begin to talk about the implications. Read the last paragraph of the discussion, the concluding paragraph that talks about the implications and further research that kind of goes back to telling you about the puzzle and how this research, this little piece of the research, this article fits in with the overall picture. And then I would say to also look at the limitation section of the discussion, because that will help as you go through the rest of the article. It will give you some sense of the biases and potential issues that the authors themselves identified. And you can think about what other issues or limitations you might think you might see occurring that the authors didn't mention. Then look at the pictures. So go to the findings section or the results section and look at the tables or the graphs. The tables should give you a sense of the results. And then after you've looked at the pictures, which give you a summary of the results, look at the text, the narrative, the author's description of the results, and they should highlight key findings. And you should think about whether their key findings make sense given the data that they presented. So in other words, if you look at the table and you see that 50% of clients stated they were, or 51% of clients stated they were highly satisfied, and 49% of clients stated that they were not satisfied with their care. And then you read the narrative description and it says a majority of clients were highly satisfied with their care. That is a true statement, but having looked at the table first, you can evaluate how well you think the description or the conclusions the author is choosing to highlight, how well it matches the actual data, and how well it answers the stated research questions from the abstract. Then look over the methods. Ask yourself whether the methods fit the study question, the overall research question. And take a look at how you feel, at how the authors operationalize the variables and what they say they did. And whether you feel, make some decisions around, think critically around whether you think what they did and how they operationalize their variables constitutes good research, and what some of the potential biases of the methods that they chose are. So for example, if the method section say that the authors did a cross-sectional survey, you now know that this research study is not going to be powered to describe cause and effect because it's cross-sectional. And cross-sectional research, by definition, just provides a snapshot of a moment in time. It doesn't speak to cause and effect. Then finally, go back to the introduction and look for how the authors think what they did fit into the big picture. What were their research questions? Do you think the research questions match the methods and the findings and the discussion? And then go back to the discussion and read it thoroughly and well, rather than just skimming or reading certain paragraphs. And so look at what the researchers think the findings mean, and think about whether, given what you now know, you agree with their interpretation. Think about whether the findings have, in fact, advanced the field or contribute something important to our overall understanding of the big picture. And then think about the implications of the findings or the results, both what the authors say the implications are and what you feel the implications are. And then think about how these findings apply to your population? Given what you know and your deep expertise and clinical experience with your population, are the implications the authors identify relevant? And are the findings even relevant? Are there reasons you can think of that these findings might not apply to your population or be relevant for your population? So in general, here are some questions to think about when you read a study. So what's going on here? Why was this study done? How was it done? What's happening overall? Who were included in the sample? Who were excluded from the sample? And who, by default, the authors aren't stating that they were excluded, but were excluded by default. What are the built-in assumptions and biases? What can you tell from how the researchers present their data? What does that imply about their biases, and what are the assumptions being stated or not being stated? Do you think that the author's conclusions really actually match the results that they had? So in other words, given what they found, do you agree with their overall assessment? What are some alternate explanations for the results? What other information do you want to know? What did the authors leave out? And what would you do differently if you had the opportunity to do this study better? In summary, it's important to always bring your critical thinking to the research evidence.